Hello everybody, my name is Luis Garcia and today I will be talking about how violent video games implicate youth's behavior. The main reason why I decided to research this topic is because growing up, I was actually exposed to violent video games with, my brother and about 90% of my social group, which were kids about my age as well. They also played a lot of video games, a lot of violent video games, and we actually grew up and we are not showing any violent behavior due to the violent video games that we played. For that reason, I was actually biased, believing that violent video games and violent behavior had no correlation whatsoever. But after completing my research on this topic, I quickly learned that I was not absolutely right, and they were things where, of course, I was not completely educated on. So let's jump into the introduction. The first thing that we need to understand is that violent video games exposure is defined as playing a game for more than 1 hour daily. The purpose of my investigation is to understand the influence of these games in young people, including their behavior and their overall health, by examining aggressive and violent conduct. So one fact is that studies, including cognitive and psychological studies, have shown that people vulnerable to violent video games do show effects on their behavior. One thing that we need to understand about this sentence is that there are people or kids who are more vulnerable to violence than others, but we will be exploring the reasons why some of the kids are, more vulnerable than others. So violent video games exposure might affect more than just the physical and the mental health. This is actually a fact. So a study has shown that violent video games exposure may also cause change in their attitude and their beliefs, either their overall beliefs in social aspects or their religious beliefs as well. Lastly, limited restriction due to difficulty. So yes, parents are actually facing difficulty to restrict their kids from playing these violent video games because there's a lot of exposure and there's a lot of content out there, especially on the internet, where they can access these games, or they can watch footage of these games, or they can pretty much just play these video games with their peers, with their friends as well. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the background and significance. So violent video games exposure may not be a new form of media. This is actually, of course, is another fact. So it is definitely, it may not be a new form of media violence, but it's definitely a new way to experience violence through media. So for instance, in a video game, the user or the person who's playing chooses who wins or who loses, and how much violence occurs in the actual video game. On the other hand, there are actually, it is very standard for video games to have these adjustable settings where they can lower the amount of gore, the amount of blood, or the amount of overall violence that is experienced in the video game, which is which is not a feature where you can that you can observe in, let's say, TV or on streaming services or in movies. The role-playing aspect of video games make them so appealing to youth. So yes, definitely violent video games, even though they are not catered or designed or even marketed for people, for kids, they are definitely their number one target, and their consumers as well. There are no laws preventing children from accessing violent video games through the internet, which is actually a fact. Back in the early 2000s, when I was a child, when I was growing up, there were websites who offered very low quality video games or mini games. Who, these video games would range from being like sports games to first person shooters to simple tic-tac-toe video games, and it would range through all the way to the other side of the spectrum, from adult content, pornography, and other kinds of games that were absolutely just catered for adults. Now today, those websites are not so popular, but still the internet has a lot of access for these kids with no restrictions, so they can just go ahead and pretty much just watch footage from a violent video game, or actually download the video game illegally and play it themselves. So yeah. Okay. Now we're going to go over the implications of violent video games to the youth's belief system. So beliefs about the nature of aggression, offensiveness, and punishments are important factors in explaining violent video games exposure. So if a kid truly understands that violence is wrong, either by learning it from school, from their peers, or their parents, then once they experience violence in either media, games or movies, they will acknowledge the violence, and they will understand that the violence happening is not actually real. Therefore, it's not going to fuel any violence or create any violence, develop any violence behavior. On the other hand, if a kid believes that violence is okay and that it has been normalized in society, then the exposure to violent video games is going to intensify over time their actual violent behavior. A child's perception on reaction to offensiveness determines how vulnerable they are to violence in video games. So yes, this is actually a fact, and we have seen it time and time over, where a viral video, we have seen hundreds of viral videos where a kid is playing a game of competitive nature. They constantly either lose or get teased by their adversary, and this actually causes the player to become aggressive. It fuels their aggressiveness, and they pretty much just get offended. The more offended a person gets, the more vulnerable they are to violence in video games. So yes, it could be understood that a parent needs to evaluate their children's behavior or reaction to offensiveness before they get exposed to violent video games. Conclusion. So the question is, does violence affect a child's behavior? The answer is simply yes and no. If a children is very susceptible to being offended, then yes, video games does cause violent behavior. But as we can understand from my research, is that even though it does cause violence, there are other factors that need to be taken into considerations. So, in conclusion, violent video games is not for everybody. Violent video games are not for every single children, and it's their parents' responsibility to understand which kid can or cannot have access to these violent video games.